Hey everyone, you are listening to Vegan Theology, episode 25 with Kevin and Sarah Hale. What's going on, Sarah?
Good morning, Kevin.
How are you?
Awesome.
Yeah?
How are you?
Good. Yeah, real good.
Yay. Yeah, I think I'm even more excited than usual to be sitting here across from you today. We are, for the first time, in a room dedicated to our podcasting work.
Yeah.
Up until now, we've been working from our dining room table, which is a very common area of our home. And as much as we love animals,
Oh, yeah.
before we became vegan, we adopted a few cats for our children to enjoy. And
Right.
Our children are basically launched and moved out, but we still have these cats.
Right. They love to join the podcast.
Whenever we sit down at the dining room table, they want to be involved and
Right.
rubbing up against the microphones and
Many times sitting on Sarah's lap while she's got a computer and a book.
Yeah.
A cat.
just
Yeah.
a teensy bit distracting.
A little bit.
So our son moved out, and then a nephew moved in,
Right.
and then our nephew moved out, and we were like, ooh,
Yeah.
to have a room we could go in and shut the door
Right.
is really, really exciting.
Yeah.
It feels very luxurious.
Yeah. I know. It's pretty nice.
Yeah, so here we are. I thought maybe today we would start out our podcast with a poem, which actually appears in Malcom Guite's Lent book. The title of the book is Word in the Wilderness, where he has some of his original poetry, of course, but he also quotes and then discusses, kind of breaks down a lot of different poems by other poets.
Yeah.
So the poem I found for today is called Strong Son of God, Immortal Love by Alfred Tennyson. Strong Son of God, immortal love, whom we that have not seen thy face by faith and faith alone embrace, believing where we cannot prove. Our little systems have their day, they have their day and cease to be. They are but broken lights of thee. And thou, O Lord, art more than they. We have but faith, we cannot know, for knowledge is of things we see, and yet we trust it comes from thee, a beam in darkness. Let it grow. Let knowledge grow from more to more, but more of reverence in us dwell, that mind and soul, according well, may make one music as before. That mind and soul, according well, may make one music as before. That our mind and our soul can at last be aligned with each other. I really liked how Tennyson says, we have our little systems, we have our little understanding. He describes them as they're but broken lights of God. And God is more than our little systems. And it just made me think, yeah, here we are endeavoring to work out our theology, to work out our faith, to work out our knowledge as best we can in our very flawed ways.
Right.
But that is the work. I mean, what's the option? What's the alternative?
Right.
To stop trying?
Well, no, and it plays into everything that I believe about why we're doing this, and that is not a lot of people are doing it. Books are being written, mostly by scholars and, others, but I think we're tired of being told what to think about our theology when it comes to animals. As we're bumping into other Christians and people at church, they don't care about animals maybe the way we do. And of course, we're trying to approach the idea that, hey, let's take a look at our theology. Let's look at God's values. Let's look at how consistent God is, and yet he calls us to be like him. And so anyway, it's just a reminder to me. I think it was, who was it, Maya Angelou or Toni Morrison said, write the book you always wanted to read or something like that. And I feel like that's how I think about this podcast. Like, we are discovering our own theology by doing it, but also we're making something that we're not finding, essentially.
And thank God that we live in this time where we can connect with other people who are having the same kinds of questions that we are, and who are saying, hey, where are the resources? Where's the work that's already been done?
Right.
And we can start to come together and form a community and help each other, feed each other, sharpen each other. So that's a part of what we're trying to do for sure.
100%.
Let's go to the lectionary for the 5th Sunday of Lent. And once again, very interesting texts available to us. I think today we should start with the Psalm. It's a very familiar Psalm, Psalm 51. You'll remember it as the Create in Me a Clean Heart Psalm, where David is repenting and confessing about his contrition over the adultery that he's committed, the murder he's committed. But what I want to focus in on is the second half of that Psalm. So I'll just read it and then let's discuss.
Yeah.
So starting in verse 13, David writes, "Then I will teach transgressors your ways, so that sinners will turn back to you. Deliver me from the guilt of bloodshed, O God, you who are God, my Savior, and my tongue will sing of your righteousness. Open my lips, Lord, and my mouth will declare your praise. You do not delight in sacrifice, or I would bring it. You do not take pleasure in burnt offerings. My sacrifice, O God, is a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart. You, God, will not despise. May it please you to prosper Zion, to build up the walls of Jerusalem. Then you will delight in the sacrifices of the righteous, in burnt offerings offered whole. Then bulls will be offered on your altar." So what jumped out at me, we keep teasing this idea that after Lent, we're going to dive into the subject of atonement and animal sacrifice. Whether or not or how or not does animal sacrifice fit within God's character and our relationship to God.
Right.
And, when I was first reading this earlier in the week, I was like, oh my goodness, this is just one more of those passages in the Old Testament where the writer says, I know you don't want animal sacrifices from me, God. Like, here I am, so repentant. I'm so broken. I'm begging you for forgiveness. I'm begging to be made right with you again. And I want to do whatever it takes to fix this relationship, to repair this relationship. And that's where David says, you do not delight in sacrifice, or I would bring it. You do not take pleasure in burnt offerings. My sacrifice, O God, is a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart. You, God, will not despise. So I'm thinking, awesome. Here's another passage where the scripture writer is saying, I know that you're not a God who demands sacrifice or even wants sacrifice. You don't value the idea of me killing an animal for you.
Right.
So why then, literally 2 verses later, does David say the opposite? May it please you to prosper Zion. I mean, it almost feels like we were talking about one thing and now we're kind of changing the subject almost. It's almost like, does this even really fit here? May it please you to prosper Zion, to build up the walls of Jerusalem. Then you will delight in the sacrifices of the righteous, in burnt offerings offered whole. Then bulls will be offered on your altar. So it's a troubling scripture.
When I first heard it, well, first of all, maybe it could be a mistranslation or an addition. Who knows? We should probably look into that. But when I first heard it, I took it as bull, like a bowl of grain. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, a grain offering,
I'm going to offer a bowl of grain offerings. But no, we talked about it and you were like, no.
Yeah, bulls, burnt offerings offered whole. Yeah, it's troubling because it doesn't just seem like a direct contradiction.
Right.
It is a direct contradiction. And so you have to wonder why. And like one of the things that comes up for me, and I know I've quoted this quote from John Walton at least 3 times on this podcast, which is really interesting, but it was obviously a big takeaway for me.
Right.
John Walton said, when you're reading the Old Testament, whatever would already be thought, believed, understood by the ancient Near Eastern person, if you find that in the text, that is not revelation.
Yeah.
It's just their culture. It's what they already think. It's what they already understand. if you're looking for revelation in the scripture, look for the things that would be so foreign and confusing and surprising to the ancient Near Eastern person.
Yeah.
So again, we used that a lot when we did our first episode, which was about how our creation narrative is so unique in that it's devoid of violence.
Right.
And God, the creator, is a God of peace. That would have been revelation to the ancient Near Eastern person.
Right.
And so I was thinking similarly about animal sacrifice. What would be more shocking to an ancient Near Eastern person's mind, that God demands animal sacrifice or that God does not appreciate animal sacrifice?
Right.
I mean, as we know, the ancient Near Eastern people were all sacrificing animals to their gods.
Right.
It was just part of the pagan culture. So what would have been shocking is that, oh, this guy doesn't want you to kill animals and offer them up. You don't need to do that.
Right.
That would have been very foreign, even a little scary. In fact, I know I'm going off on a tangent here,
Fine.
but there's a book that we need to read. It's on our list, talking about how weird the early church appeared to the rest of the Roman Empire. And one of the things was they weren't doing any animal sacrifices. And so it wasn't like, oh, live and let live. You guys don't want to do animal sacrifices. That's fine. No, it's like, you're putting us all in danger.
Right.
If you're not sacrificing to the gods, we're all going to be punished because of you.
Right.
So to me, that's a really strong argument. When we find in scripture the writers saying God does not want our sacrifices, that is revelation.
Right.
And
Good.
interesting. Did you want to say more about that
I
one?
was just going to say good stuff. Yeah.
Okay, good. So the other two readings from the lectionary I want to focus on, the epistle and the gospel, they are looking at Christ, the sacrifice of Christ. So the idea of sacrifice is what's running through these lectionary readings for this week. The epistle reading is Hebrews chapter 5. So the epistle reading is Hebrews chapter 5, another familiar passage to us. And it talks about Jesus being not only the high priest, but the high priest who doesn't just offer sacrifices on behalf of the people, but the high priest who makes himself the sacrifice on behalf of the people. Hebrews 5, every high priest is selected from among the people and is appointed to represent the people in matters related to God, to offer gifts and sacrifices for sins. He is able to deal gently with those who are ignorant and are going astray, since he himself is subject to weakness. This is why he has to offer sacrifices for his own sins as well as for the sins of the people. And no one takes this honor on himself, but he receives it when called by God, just as Aaron was. In the same way, Christ did not take on himself the glory of becoming a high priest, but God said to him, "You are my son. Today I have become your father." And he says in another place, "You are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek." During the days of Jesus' life on earth, he offered up prayers and petitions with fervent cries and tears to the one who could save him from death. And he was heard because of his reverent submission. Son though he was, he learned obedience from what he suffered. And once made perfect, he became the source of eternal salvation for all who obey him, and was designated by God to be high priest in the order of Melchizedek. I think it's so interesting. Like, God clearly works with our culture.
Right.
And so this paradigm of the high priest and the sacrificing of animals on behalf of the people, and then God makes Jesus the ultimate high priest. And again, Jesus isn't just offering up prayers for us and offering up sacrifices for us. Jesus says, I'm the sacrifice. Let me pay it all. Let me pay the cost. Like, nobody else has to pay the cost. Let me.
Right.
Which, once again, I just love how Lindsay and his Christology really drew this out, that we are to be like Jesus. Our model is a model of self-sacrifice, self-giving. So continuing on with this idea of sacrifice and of Jesus' sacrifice, let's go to the Gospel of John, John chapter 12. I'm going to start reading in verse 23. Jesus replied, "The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified. Very truly, I tell you, unless a kernel of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains only a single seed. But if it dies, it produces many seeds. Anyone who loves their life will lose it, while anyone who hates their life in this world will keep it for eternal life. Whoever serves me must follow me, and where I am, my servant also will be. My Father will honor the one who serves me. Now my soul is troubled, and what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour? No, it was for this very reason I came to this hour. Father, glorify your name. Then a voice came from heaven. I have glorified it and will glorify it again. The crowd that was there and heard it said that it had thundered. Others said an angel had spoken to him. Jesus said, this voice was for your benefit, not mine. Now is the time for judgment on this world. Now the prince of this world will be driven out, and I, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all people to myself. He said this to show the kind of death he was going to die. The crowd spoke up, we have heard from the law that the Messiah will remain forever. So how can you say the Son of Man will be lifted up? Who is this Son of Man? Then Jesus told them, you are going to have the light just a little while longer. Walk while you have the light, before darkness overtakes you. Whoever walks in the dark does not know where they are going. Believe in the light while you have the light, so that you may become children of light. When he had finished speaking, Jesus left and hid himself from them. So again, this beautiful idea that Jesus is saying, this is why I came. And if you want to be my disciple, you have to do the same thing. And God will honor you if you do. All right. And now we'll turn to the portion of the show where we've been working our way through Gayle Boss's book called Wild Hope, Stories for Lent from the Vanishing. I really do appreciate this book.
Yeah.
Kind of what we were alluding to at the beginning of the show. At this point, it still feels like it's hard to find resources, Christian resources that are helpful to us, that do look at the non-human animals we share this planet with.
Right.
It's almost like a taboo subject. It's just not a consideration to think about the world of non-human animals in relation to our relationship with God, our Christianity.
Right.
So the fact that this book exists is really awesome. Chapter 5 is called The Hunted. So we've been through the hungry, the homeless, the poisoned, or the sick. Oh, the poisoned and the sick. In all of those, I would say what's happening to these animals, what's forcing them into extinction, is a byproduct or an unintended consequence for human activity, like global warming or animal agriculture. Some of these animals that are going extinct, it's not like we're targeting them specifically. It's just they're unfortunately having their lives taken from them as a unintended byproduct almost of what we're doing. Whereas obviously the hunted, these animals that are endangered of going extinct because of human hunting, that's obviously a more direct targeting of these animals. So it's all sad, honestly, but this felt a little more...
Yeah, this chapter, I felt the same way. This chapter was just a little more depressing than the previous chapters. And the previous chapters have been...
Yeah, they're all heartbreaking, but when people are going out and hunting these animals that are disappearing from the planet.
Right. And I feel like Gayle Boss in this chapter really does a good job of just trying to show how the animal's just trying to survive and live its life and have babies and do what it does. And their lives get interrupted by humans who then basically sell them as a commodity.
No, I like what you said. Like, she does a good job of... Exactly. Like, this animal is just trying to live.
Right.
This animal just wants to survive. Is all this animal wants.
Right.
She also does a great job of showing just how awesome, just a little picture into how amazing each of these animals and how unique. I mean, the variety that God created is so beautiful. And that's one reason I'm really enjoying this book. And speaking of which, I mean, this first one, right, is such an interesting animal.
It is an interesting animal.
The Chinese pangolin. I heard about this for the very first time when the coronavirus first emerged on the scene. And on the news reports, there was footage of these Chinese wet markets, right? These
Right.
filthy conditions of, dead animals right next to living animals, animals of all species from all over the place. And they're all mixing their germs
Right.
and with the people walking through. And
Right.
this is just a breeding ground for a pandemic. Look at how filthy and disgusting,
Right.
It was like a very not subtle racist overtones
Right.
to the whole thing.
Right.
Because I'm thinking, have you been in a factory farm?
Right.
Like,
Exactly.
you want to talk filth
Right.
and sickness and animals piled on top of each other. They're on top of dead animals and they're on top of all the waste and
Well, and that also just
open sores.
yeah, and it just reminds me, it's worth noting that 85% of the illnesses that humans get, so we've learned, are from animals or zoonotic diseases.
But this Chinese pangolin is a mammal, kind of similar to an anteater in terms of its
Yeah.
long, sticky tongue.
It also made me think of an armadillo.
But yeah, the body has, she writes, any medieval knight would have envied her armored suit.
Yeah.
She has overlapping scales, 18 rows in variegated shades of bronze protect her. And what's so awesome about her is she carries her baby. Her baby kind of clings to her tail as they go out at night. She's nocturnal. And she's great at burrowing, and she has these long 2-inch front claws. So she can walk on her hind legs,
Yeah.
or when she's on her all fours, she kind of she walks on her knuckles, folds her nails back.
Right.
She has these valuable tools that are just, she's an expert digger.
Right.
But the baby's kind of hanging on to her tail. But whenever there is a threat to their safety, because Chinese pangolins live in Nepal's Himalayan foothills, with great cats like tigers,
Right.
whenever there is any kind of threat, she slides her baby onto her belly and she curls around it as she becomes this impenetrable ball
Right.
that not even a tiger's fangs can pierce through.
Yeah, it's pretty amazing.
Yeah, her scales are made of keratin, which is like the same thing as our fingernails, and rhino horns.
Yeah.
This is her only defense. It's this suit of armor.
Yeah.
And yeah, she just sounds amazing. And she eats insects, and there's fewer and fewer of them in existence. And so the chapter goes on to tell us about how there's really a market for pangolins, Chinese pangolins.
Yeah.
And people will come to the Chinese villages and offer money to whoever wants to go out and capture pangolins. And it's really hard to resist that. If you're a peasant barely surviving and someone's offering you a really nice sum of money,
Right.
it's really hard to resist that temptation.
Yeah.
I think we see that throughout this chapter, honestly, is that
Yeah.
it's the world's poorest people who are often tempted to go ahead and hunt these animals for a little bit of profit. Even though obviously we continue to do it, we're not going to have these animals to hunt at all.
Right.
Yeah, she says that Chinese pangolins are actually the most trafficked animal in the world.
Yeah.
And then once the person has obtained these pangolins and is going to go sell them, they do things like shove tubes down the pangolins' throats and force feed them. It says a limestone slurry.
Yeah.
And they inject water under the pangolin's skin. And this is all just to increase their weight, artificially increase their weight, which will yield them an even larger profit
Right.
when they go to sell it. And so she explains in China's best restaurants, menus boast savory pangolin dishes like pangolin fetus stew. But also in medicine shops, the scales are pulverized and then prescribed for all kinds of ailments.
Right.
Psoriasis, circulation, asthma, anxiety, cancer. And so she says that a Chinese pangolin is snatched from the wild every 5 minutes, more than 2 million in the last 15 years.
Yeah, that's unbelievable.
Just such a unique nocturnal, amazing animal.
Right.
Again, who just wants to survive.
Yeah.
And we're driving them out of existence. And then we go to Madagascar
Yeah.
to learn about the ring-tailed lemur.
Yeah, I was kind of surprised. They said the lemur, different species, they range from the size of a gorilla to the size of a mouse.
Yeah, and
That
they
is
only
crazy.
exist on this one island.
I know.
Right?
Can you imagine a gorilla-sized lemur?
Yeah, right. And so this chapter follows a young scientist who goes to Madagascar to study one of the lemur species that's left, the ring-tailed lemur. Of the 750,000 ring-tailed lemurs that roam Madagascar when this particular scientist was born, so probably a few decades ago, out of the 750,000 that were in Madagascar, now there's about 2,500.
That is unbelievable.
And so once again, one of the problems is habitat fragmentation, as their habitat is used for basically mining and foresting and animal agriculture.
Yeah,
And
animal agriculture.
yeah. So she describes these animals and these lemurs in the wild, and they're just...
Yeah, very interesting creatures.
It reminded me a lot of the river otters we read about last chapter. So social, like these multi-generational social structures in which they pick a leader and they pick, who gets to eat first. They're leaving their scent behind.
Yeah.
And they can, just from the scent rubbings they leave, they can tell sex, age, genetics, virility, fertility, illness, stress.
Yeah, it was fascinating.
From one group to the next.
I know.
They know exactly who's been passing by. Wow. I mean, once again, humans cannot even compare to the skills of even a ring-tailed lemur. Not only are they able to smell all of these things about each other, but they also have these calls, these vocalizations. Scientists have determined they have at least 28 nuanced calls. They're communicating with each other constantly.
Right.
And of course, they groom each other and they purr to each other and they fall asleep on each other. And they're just, it just sounds so joyful, honestly. Like their existence together it's just beautiful. But people are hunting them.
They're hunted, I guess, as pets. They're hunted as part of this illegal pet trade. She gives an example in here where they're being used at a hotel as like a prop or as a...
Yeah, like tourists can take their picture with a
tourist attraction at a hotel. There's this lemur. You can feed it a cookie and it'll come grab it. But in the process, she mentions that if a baby is found with a mother, the baby will be sold for like $2, which is basically like 3 days' wages for these hunters.
Wow.
We're talking about the poor people in a village. They're just trying to make a living. And so it's easy for them to succumb to this kind of illegal trade. And it's just sad because a lot of the lemurs, they're pretty amazing creatures, and they try to fight and get away and bite and scratch, and of course they're killed in the process. They're not eating their natural food. I think in this chapter they're talking about tamarind trees. They eat these pods from tamarind trees, and it's very sad.
Right. The chapter ends with a scientist reaching out on social media to all her friends saying, visit lemurs in their wild homes, not hotels. And then she just finds comfort in picturing the lemurs under the trees and hearing them purr to each other.
Yeah, they sound so amazing.
It's really sad that we kidnap them. We separate them from their rich family social structure.
Yep.
And we put them in these foreign environments, feed them foreign foods just for our little
enjoyment
selfies, basically, so that we could send to our friends and look cool. So I think it's a good reminder that even when we're not talking about killing animals for food, anytime an animal is being commodified for their entertainment value, they are suffering.
Yeah.
And they are being mistreated, and many of them are being killed. Once again, when we think about our calling to be stewards and to make sure that everybody gets to thrive on this amazing planet, this is not it.
Right.
Resisting the urge to use or consume any kind of entertainment that is commodifying animals, I think, is more consistent with what we need to be doing.
Right.
So for the third animal of the chapter, The Hunted, we go to South Africa, Zimbabwe, and Zambia to study a little bit about the black rhinoceros. And I love this chapter. It is kind of told through the eyes of a brand new national park ranger.
Oh, yeah.
And at first you could tell it's a good job.
Right.
And he's doing his best, but
Right.
he's definitely not too keen to be out there in the wild with these massive, dangerous animals.
Yeah, it was really cool also to hear about how each rhino has, and it makes sense, has its own personality.
I love that. Yeah. So she describes this encounter that this park ranger has with a black rhino. So on this first day out on the job, they find a rhino, and they're very carefully trying to approach while staying downwind from the animal.
Right.
But an oxpecker warns, like sounds an alarm, basically. And so the ranger and the mentor actually like lunge into a tree
Right.
to create some distance, because while the rhinoceros has an amazing sense of hearing and even smell, he doesn't have very good sense of sight.
Yeah.
So the rhinoceros starts charging towards where he knows there is something there.
Right.
And so they jump up into this tree, but as soon as the rhinoceros gets within 8 feet of the tree and realizes, oh, it's just humans,
Right.
he just stops, to the great relief of this.
Yeah, this new ranger. Yeah.
Yeah. And then the mentor, smiling, kind of like, watch this, and he drops his hat onto the ground. The rhino sniffs it and then catches it on his long front horn and tosses it over his back.
Yeah.
And then with a dexterity defying the physics of his size, he spins and races away, huffing like a steam engine. I love this story because then the young park ranger just starts laughing. Like a moment ago, he thought he was going to die.
Right.
And now he's just realizing, like, oh my goodness, and now I've been in the presence of this rhinoceros, and such speed and agility and such impishness.
Yeah.
Just this jokester, like this little troublemaker.
Right. Well, that's what I loved about this chapter too, is that she really talked about like knowing them by being in their presence, like experiencing them could potentially change your view of them and not see them as a commodity or just see them for their horns. Because it's unfortunate what we read in this chapter, that poachers basically shoot them with a dart of opioids. And the reason they do that is so that there's not a loud bang and rangers come rushing to the scene. So they're trying to keep it quiet. And what they do is they essentially hack off his face and take the horn. It's just unfortunate. And so these animals are alive, and they're going through some sort of opioid withdrawal, and they're bleeding out. They're dehydrated. They're everything, and it's like torture.
It's terrible. Yeah, at first I was really confused why they shoot the animal with opioids.
Right.
But yeah, it makes sense. It's silent. And the other reason we read is that with a rifle, you're likely to miss.
Right.
Or just wound the animal. Whereas with opioids, it doesn't matter where you hit the animal.
Right.
It's going to take effect.
Yeah.
And it's going to cause them to fall.
Yeah, it's just sad.
Yeah. So like Kevin's mentioning, they're considered a commodity just for their horn.
Yeah, I was reading something like just an ounce of their horn is worth anywhere from $25,000 to $40,000, like especially in East Asia and China. There are beliefs about the medicinal properties of their horn that they, I guess, grind into a powder. And it's just...
So these rangers who are trying to protect these animals, they drill a hole into the horn, the back horn, and they embed a radio transmitter to pulse its whereabouts, whether it's still attached to the rhinoceros or not. And then before they wake the rhinoceros back up, they patch the hole so it's not detectable. This is the way they are trying to curb the poaching industry. Black rhinoceroses are completely extinct in Mozambique. Back in 1960, there were only 2,500 left on the continent of Africa, even though, originally there were 100,000 that roamed Africa.
That's crazy.
But South Africa has been working really hard to protect them and has helped to double the number to 5,000. But the demand, like Kevin said, from Southeast Asia for the small number of rhino horns left, their black market price has surged. And once again, she mentions the promised wealth wrecks many ordinary citizens' inner restraint.
Right.
I mean, it's really hard to say no when you're desperate for income.
Right. I feel like it's a recurring theme here. Poverty is leading to the destruction of these amazing animals.
Mm. And so, sadly, this rhino that the park ranger met on his first day, whom he named Rasta, after a European football, a non-American football.
A rugby player? Or
No, whatever. A soccer player. Soccer. I'm trying to say soccer without saying soccer. Oh. What the rest of the world refers to as football.
Real football.
Rasta, I guess, is a famous football player. So he named him after a football player. But they get a word from their radio control that a horn is moving very rapidly.
Right.
Too rapid for a rhinoceros.
For a rhino, right.
So they know something's wrong.
Right.
And they find Rasta, who is bleeding out because they've basically butchered his face and just left him to die. And this park ranger has to euthanize the rhinoceros just so it doesn't suffer. He doesn't suffer anymore.
Yeah, sad.
Yeah, and so he says at the end, the killers, the syndicate kingpins, the people who think the horn cures them, the men who carry it to look important, I hate them all. And then, it ends kind of like what you were mentioning earlier, Kevin, that being in a rhino's presence is the only thing that would stop people from being able to do this poaching. And I love how the chapter, or this section of the chapter ends, that this group of Zambian school children are going on a 3-day field trip into the park so they can be in the presence of these animals. Yeah. I'm like, that's quite a field trip.
That's wonderful, yeah.
Yeah, the rhinos are our best teachers. We bring the children into their presence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think what is cool about this chapter and the next chapter, it's about these sea turtles. They're called hawksbill turtles. Mm-hmm. They're very interesting in what they do for the coral reefs, unique among sea turtles.
Yeah, when I saw that the last section of this chapter was about a sea turtle, it broke my heart a little bit. I was like, who would mess with a sea turtle?
Right, I know.
I mean, they're just everything that is beautiful and free and delightful.
Yeah. Their meat, I guess, is by some considered to be very tasty.
Yeah. And even like an aphrodisiac. And then, of course, the tortoise shell is put into jewelry and accessories.
All that stuff.
Is very beautiful, right?
Right. But what's interesting about these particular sea turtles on the Solomon Islands is they eat sea sponges, which most animals can't eat because I guess they have like a glass-like quality about them. These sponges are ravaging coral reefs. And coral reefs are home to all kinds of animals. Mm-hmm. And so by the sea turtles actually eating the sponges off the reefs, they're actually helping to keep coral reefs vibrant and alive. So they're doing an amazing job.
They're just amazing. They hatch on the beach of a tiny little island, one of the Solomon Islands. It doesn't even really appear on maps because these islands are so tiny. And they use the light from the full moon to guide them to the water.
Right.
The timing of everything, how perfectly God created these things to work, you know.
Right.
Then they live in the water for 30 years without leaving the water until they're driven back to the island where they hatched, and they haven't been out of the water in 30 years. How weird must it feel if you've lived in the water 24/7 for 30 years, and then for the first time in 30 years, you're dragging your body out onto land.
Right.
And suddenly gravity is a thing,
Right. Yeah.
So they're led back to the island where they hatched 30 years later to lay their eggs under the light of a full moon. And then again, the moon guides them back into the water.
Right. But this is also where poachers will catch them when they're laying their eggs. And she tells a story here where the poachers are just waiting. They let her lay her eggs. They wait for her to lay her eggs. And then as she's trying to get back to the water, they hack her with machetes.
Yeah. Yeah. And of course, even without the poachers, many of them are killed, entangled in fishing nets or plastic bags or 6-pack rings, so the plastic in the ocean. And again, we know that most of the plastic in the ocean is discarded commercial fishing gear, is what kills a lot of sea turtles. I wonder what that instinct is that some animals go back to where they were born to have their young.
Yeah.
Because it's birds, it's different fishes, it's these sea turtles.
Yeah.
It's really interesting. And it's really sad when we mess it up for them so they can't get back.
Right. And I feel like that was one of the tragedies in this story, was just she's doing her thing. She's doing what she's meant to do. And she gets interrupted by poachers.
Right.
And then, of course, they tell the tale of another sea turtle that had a tracker on it. And rangers were waiting for her to lay her eggs and get back in the water. And once she got back in the water, they felt relief.
Yeah, it makes me so happy that there are humans that devote their lives to protecting animals.
Yeah.
And I think we
Being
all...
good stewards.
Yeah, we all need to think about how we can move in that direction for sure.
Right.
She also mentions that with climate change causing the sea levels to rise, a lot of these little tiny islands in the Solomon Islands are just going underwater, which will obviously prevent these sea turtles from getting back to the island they hatched on to lay their eggs. So just another way that we're making it really difficult for certain animals to continue to thrive and survive.
Right.
That's the chapter this week of Stories for Lent from the Vanishing.
Yeah, next Sunday we are excited. Conspiracy's coming out, and we were talking about the fact that it's coming out basically on Palm Sunday. It's coming out on the 20th, but we're going to see it on the 24th, which is Palm Sunday. And we may have mentioned that there's a scene in there that's pretty relevant.
Yeah, I think a lot of the movie, honestly, was kind of centered around the cleansing of the temple, which Jesus did as soon as he got to Jerusalem on Palm Sunday. And they really explore that in this movie. That's just one of the many things they explore. But as we mentioned before, we've seen the rough cut. We haven't seen the final, and it's showing in theaters. So definitely encourage you to see it. We've invited our church and some people we work with, and we're hoping to get a group together and watch it and then discuss it together.
Yeah, looking forward to it. So, yeah, we don't want to give anything away. So, but we definitely want to talk about it. So,
yeah, that'll be a future conversation.
Yeah. All right. Well, hey, thanks for listening.
Thanks, everybody.
Later.